Hey guys, tonight we begin with a small, slightly soggy island off the coast of Europe. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket. The British Empire is not going anywhere. It took centuries to build, and it will take us a very long, slow evening to wander through it. This is not a story of constant triumph. It's more of a story about ambition, tea, questionable decisions, and a truly impressive ability to show up uninvited in other people's countries. So settle in, let your breathing slow down, and let's gently drift back to a time when Britain was not yet ruling a quarter of the globe, but was already thinking about it. Because of course it was. Now, before the empire, there was England, and before England felt superior to everyone else, it was being conquered repeatedly. The William the Conqueror arrived in 1066 and essentially said, "Nice island, I'll take it." And he did. The Norman conquest reshaped England's ruling class, language, architecture, and general vibe. French-speaking elites at the top, Anglo-Saxon peasants at the bottom. A recipe for centuries of quiet resentment and very loud castles. But empire? That was still a distant dream. Medieval England was more focused on arguing with France. The Hundred Years' War dragged on from 1337 to 1453. It was less 100 years and more a series of exhausting misunderstandings. England tried to claim the French crown. France politely declined. Eventually, England lost most of its French territories, which was awkward. And then came the Tudors. Ah, yes, the family that turned marital drama into foreign policy. Henry VIII decided he wanted a divorce. The Pope said no, so Henry created his own church, because why not double down? The Church of England was born, monasteries were dissolved, and England began to drift religiously and politically away from Catholic Europe. This mattered, because when you cut ties with powerful continental allies, you start looking outward. And outward in the 1500s meant oceans. Lots of ocean. Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, inherited a tense kingdom. Catholic powers like Spain were not thrilled with Protestant England. The Spanish Armada sailed in 1588 to teach England a lesson. It did not go well for Spain. Storms helped. English ships were nimble, and suddenly England felt chosen. There's nothing quite like surviving a near invasion to give a nation a superiority complex. Elizabeth's reign also saw early explorers poking around the Atlantic. Sir Walter Raleigh tried to establish colonies in North America. Roanoke famously vanished, which should have been a gentle hint, but hints were not England's strong suit. As we glide into the 1600s, the focus shifts westward. North America became the testing ground for imperial ambition. In 1607, Jamestown was founded. It struggled. Colonists starved. They argued, they relied heavily on indigenous peoples for survival, then repaid them with land seizures. Not exactly a strong start, but it was persistent. Then came the Pilgrims in 1620, landing at Plymouth. They were seeking religious freedom. They were also deeply convinced they were correct about everything, which is a powerful combination. Over time, more colonies appeared, 13 of them along the eastern seaboard. They grew tobacco, they traded furs, and increasingly they relied on enslaved labor. The transatlantic slave trade became a horrifyingly efficient triangle: goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, raw materials back to Europe. Wealth accumulated in British ports like Liverpool and Bristol. It was brutal, it was profitable, and it was foundational to the empire's growth. Meanwhile, Britain was figuring itself out at home. In 1707, the Kingdom of Great Britain was formed through the union of England and Scotland. One parliament, one crown, fewer excuses for internal war, more energy available for external expansion. Because if there is one thing Britain enjoyed, it was external expansion. The 1700s were busy. Britain and France competed constantly. The 7 Years' War, fought from 1656 to 1663, was basically a world war before world wars were fashionable. Battles occurred in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. When it ended, Britain had gained Canada and strengthened its hold in India. France was pushed back. Britain felt unstoppable. It was now the dominant naval power, and it had territories spanning continents. India, in particular, deserves a slow moment of attention. The British East India Company began as a trading enterprise in 1600. Spices, textiles, tea. Innocent enough, but over time, it acquired private armies. Yes, a company with armies, because apparently that seemed reasonable. By the mid-1700s, after the Battle of Plassey in 1557, the company effectively controlled large parts of Bengal. Revenue flowed back to Britain. Famines devastated local populations. Corporate rule mixed with imperial ambition. It was messy, profitable for shareholders, catastrophic for many Indians. Back in North America, the 13 colonies were growing restless. Britain had debts from the 7 Years' War, so it tried to tax the colonies. Stamp Act, Tea Act, small, seemingly practical measures. The colonists were not amused. No taxation without representation, they said, which was fair. They had no seats in Parliament. Britain disagreed, because Britain often disagreed. In 1776, the colonies declared independence. The American Revolution dragged on until 1783. Britain lost. Losing 13 colonies was embarrassing. It was also clarifying. Instead of abandoning empire, Britain recalibrated. If America was gone, then Asia, Africa, and the Pacific looked even more appealing. Australia became a penal colony in 1888, a place to send convicts, because when you lose America, you need somewhere to relocate your criminals. The continent, already home to indigenous Aboriginal peoples for tens of thousands of years, was declared terra nullius by the British, which was convenient and untrue. As we float into the early 1800s, Britain faced another enormous challenge, Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars consumed Europe, but at sea, Britain maintained dominance. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 secured naval supremacy. Admiral Nelson died, dramatically. Britain won, practically. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, Britain emerged as the world's leading global power. Its navy ruled the seas, its trade networks spanned continents, its industrial economy was accelerating. Ah, yes, the Industrial Revolution. Coal, steam engines, factories, textiles. Britain transformed itself into the workshop of the world. Cities expanded rapidly, conditions were grim, child labor was common, air quality was optional, but production soared. Industrial strength fed imperial ambition. Manufactured goods needed markets. Factories needed raw materials. The empire provided both. India supplied cotton. The Caribbean produced sugar. Africa provided palm oil and, tragically, labor. The 1800s became the high noon of empire, and at its symbolic center sat Queen Victoria. She reigned from 1337 to 1901, a very long time, long enough to become the human embodiment of British dominance. Under Victoria, the empire expanded dramatically. In 1837, Indian soldiers rebelled against the East India Company in what is often called the Indian Rebellion. It was violent, it was chaotic, it shattered illusions of easy corporate rule. Afterward, the British government dissolved the company's authority and took direct control. India became the jewel in the crown. Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1776 because Queen was apparently not quite enough. And so, as we gently close this first stretch of our journey, Britain stands in the late 19th century at the height of its power, a small island commanding vast territories, confident, industrial, certain of its civilizing mission. Of course, that confidence would eventually crack, but not yet. For now, the empire hums. Ships glide across oceans, administrators draft reports, tea is poured in drawing rooms thousands of miles apart, and the sun, as they liked to say, never sets. In our next drift together, we'll wander deeper into Victorian grandeur, African partition maps drawn with straight lines, and the quiet anxieties of ruling too much of the world. So breathe. Let the image of that damp little island fade softly in your mind.
All right, let's ease back in. The year is somewhere in the late 1800s. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and overconfidence. Britain is at the height of its power. The empire stretches so widely across the globe that school children are confidently informed the sun never sets on it, which sounds poetic and slightly exhausting. Imagine trying to manage that many time zones. At the center of it all sits Queen Victoria, small in stature, widowed for decades, permanently dressed in black, and yet ruling over roughly a quarter of the planet's land surface. It's an interesting contrast, a grieving grandmother presiding over global domination. History is full of these little tonal mismatches. By the 1870s and 1880s, Britain had moved past casual colonization. It was now aggressively strategic, especially in Africa. Let's gently float over to Berlin in 1884, because of course Europe decided to carve up an entire continent in a conference room. The Berlin Conference brought European powers together to divide Africa into neat pieces on a map. No African leaders were invited, which feels like a small but telling detail. Britain secured huge swaths: Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, parts of East Africa, Southern Africa. France took its share, Germany grabbed some. Belgium, under Leopold II of Belgium, acquired the Congo Free State, which was neither particularly free nor gently managed. The British justified their expansion with talk of trade, order, and civilization. They built railways. They introduced English legal systems. They also extracted resources, suppressed resistance, and redrew boundaries with straight lines that ignored ethnic and cultural realities. Because straight lines are so tidy, reality is less so. Meanwhile, Egypt became strategically vital. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, linked the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. It was the shortcut to India, and India was everything. When Egyptian finances collapsed, Britain stepped in, initially just to stabilize things. By 1882, British forces occupied Egypt outright. It was technically still part of the Ottoman Empire, but practically it answered to London. India, though, remained the crown jewel. After the rebellion of 1857, governance was reorganized under the British Raj. A viceroy represented the crown. British civil servants ran administration. Railways expanded rapidly. Telegraph lines stretched across the subcontinent. It was an enormous bureaucratic project, and it ran on hierarchy. British officials at the top, Indian subjects below. Racial theories were popular. Confidence was high. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Indian intellectuals began forming political organizations. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded. At first, it was moderate. It asked politely for more representation. Empires rarely enjoy polite requests. Back home, Britain was undergoing its own transformation. The Industrial Revolution had created immense wealth. It had also created crowded cities, labor unrest, and vast inequalities. Reform movements pushed for expanded voting rights. The Reform Acts of the 19th century gradually broadened the electorate. So while Britain ruled millions abroad without representation, it was cautiously expanding democracy at home. History enjoys irony. The late Victorian era also brought a certain imperial culture. Boys read adventure novels about brave explorers in Africa. Maps in classrooms were shaded reassuringly red to indicate British territory. Tea, sourced largely from India and Ceylon, became a national ritual. It was empire made domestic. Ordinary citizens felt connected to distant lands they would never see. And then, in 1899, came the Boer War in South Africa.
British forces clashed with Dutch-descended settlers over control of territory rich in gold and diamonds. It was not the easy victory Britain expected. The war dragged on. Guerrilla tactics frustrated the British Army. Concentration camps were established for Boer civilians. Conditions were grim. Public criticism grew. For perhaps the first time in decades, Britain's moral certainty wobbled. Ruling an empire was not just parades and polished boots. It was costly, bloody, complicated. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, an era ended. She had reigned for 63 years. Her death felt symbolic. The empire was still vast, but the mood was shifting. Her son, Edward VII, brought a lighter, more social tone to the monarchy. Fewer black dresses, more dinner parties. But geopolitically, Europe was growing tense. Germany, newly unified under Otto by Bismarck decades earlier, had become an industrial powerhouse. It wanted colonies. It wanted influence. Naval arms races began. Britain, proud of its navy, built more ships. Germany built more ships. Everyone felt slightly paranoid. Let's drift into 1914, a summer that felt normal, until it didn't. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered alliances like falling dominoes. Britain declared war on Germany, and suddenly the empire was mobilized. The World War I was vast, brutal, industrialized slaughter on a scale previously unimaginable. Soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Africa, all parts of the empire fought under the British flag. They fought in trenches in France, in deserts in the Middle East, in campaigns across Africa. The empire was not just London issuing orders, it was millions of colonial subjects risking and losing their lives. When the war ended in 1918, Britain was technically victorious, but it was financially drained. An entire generation had been scarred. The illusion of effortless superiority had dissolved in mud and barbed wire. Still, the empire actually grew larger after the war. Former German and Ottoman territories were handed to Britain as League of Nations mandates: Iraq, Palestine, Tanganyika. More land, more responsibility, more quiet complications. In Ireland, things were unraveling. Nationalist movements pushed for independence. After years of tension and violence, the Irish Free State was established in 1922, though Northern Ireland remained within the United Kingdom. It was a significant loss and a warning. Meanwhile, in India, calls for self-rule intensified. A slight, soft-spoken lawyer named Mahatma Gandhi began advocating nonviolent resistance, salt marches, boycotts, civil disobedience. It was disarmingly effective. Britain struggled to justify imprisoning peaceful protesters demanding rights it claimed to cherish. The interwar period was uneasy. Britain still had the largest empire on earth, but economically it was struggling. The Great Depression hit in the 1930s, unemployment rose, political extremism spread across Europe. Then came 1939, another war, this time against Nazi Germany. The World War II tested Britain to its core. The Blitz bombed London. Resources were stretched thin. Once again, soldiers from across the empire fought. India alone contributed over 2 million troops. By 1945, Britain stood on the winning side, but victory felt different now. The country was exhausted, bankrupt, dependent on American loans. And something fundamental had changed. The colonies had fought, they had sacrificed, they had industrialized, they had organized politically. The idea that Britain could indefinitely rule vast populations without granting independence felt unrealistic. India became the turning point. In 1947, after negotiations and mounting pressure, Britain granted independence, but it came with partition. India and Pakistan were created. Violence followed. Millions were displaced. It was a painful, chaotic end to nearly 2 centuries of direct British rule. And once India was gone, the empire's spine was weakened.
Other colonies soon followed: Burma, Ceylon, African nations throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. The map steadily lost its red shading. Back in Britain, the mood was complex. There was nostalgia, there was relief, there was economic recalibration. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain attempted to reassert control over the Suez Canal and was firmly pressured to withdraw by the United States and the Soviet Union, made one thing painfully clear: Britain was no longer the dominant global power. It was a difficult realization. Yet the empire did not vanish entirely. It transformed. The Commonwealth emerged as a voluntary association of former colonies, a softer connection, shared history, shared language, fewer gunboats. And so, as we gently close this second stretch of our quiet imperial wander, Britain stands in the mid-20th century, diminished in territory, but not erased. The empire that once boasted it would never see sunset had, in fact, watched many evenings.
All right, let's settle in for the final stretch. The empire has shrunk. The maps are less red. The confidence is quieter. Britain is no longer running half the globe before breakfast, and yet it still wakes up every morning with centuries of imperial memory humming softly in the background. Because empires don't just disappear, they linger. In accents, in architecture, in family stories about when we were in India. So let's drift gently into the second half of the 20th century. After World War II, Britain was financially strained. Cities were damaged, industry needed rebuilding, the welfare state expanded under Prime Minister Clement Attlee, the National Health Service was founded in 1948. Social reforms reshaped domestic life. It's almost tender, really, a former imperial giant focusing inward, free healthcare instead of foreign conquest, a quieter kind of ambition. But the global retreat continued. The 1956 Suez Crisis remains a symbolic turning point. Britain, along with France and Israel, attempted to regain control of the Suez Canal after Egypt nationalized it under Gamal Abdel Nasser. It did not go well. International pressure, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union, forced Britain to withdraw. The message was clear: the old imperial swagger no longer carried weight. For many in Britain, this was sobering, a realization that global dominance had shifted westward across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, independence movements accelerated. Across Africa and the Caribbean, British colonies transitioned into sovereign states. Some transitions were peaceful, others were not. Kenya's Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s was harshly suppressed. Cyprus saw violence. In Malaya, communist insurgencies challenged British control. Decolonization was rarely tidy. It involved negotiation, resistance, compromise, and occasionally deeply uncomfortable truths. Yet by the 1960s, the pace was undeniable. Ghana, Nigeria, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Uganda, Zambia, Barbados, the list grows steadily longer. Each independence ceremony was both a celebration and a quiet admission the empire was over. And through it all, the monarchy endured. Elizabeth II ascended the throne in 1952. She inherited not just a kingdom, but a dissolving empire. Her reign became less about ruling territories and more about maintaining symbolic unity within the Commonwealth. She traveled extensively, visited former colonies, offered continuity. If the empire was fading, the monarchy would remain as a thread connecting past and present. It's a subtle transformation, from ruler of an empire to ceremonial head of a voluntary association. There's something almost poetic about that shift. Britain itself changed dramatically. Post-war immigration reshaped society. Citizens from former colonies, India, Pakistan, and the Caribbean moved to Britain, invited initially to fill labor shortages. They brought languages, religions, food, music. Empire, in a way, came home, and not everyone was comfortable with that. Immigration debates simmered, identity politics grew more complicated. The story of empire was no longer distant and exotic, it was part of everyday British life. Economically, Britain recalibrated. It joined the European Economic Community in 1973, seeking stability and trade integration with continental Europe, a former island empire choosing partnership over dominance. And yet, nostalgia lingered. There's a particular British fondness for wartime documentaries, imperial dramas, and period pieces featuring well-dressed officers staring stoically into sunsets. The empire became aesthetic, a setting, a memory softened by time. But for many former colonies, the legacy was more complex. Borders drawn at the Berlin Conference contributed to later conflicts in Africa. Economic systems oriented towards resource extraction left structural challenges. In South Asia, the partition of 1947 cast a long shadow. History does not gently pack itself away. It lingers in institutions and tensions. Let's float briefly into the late 20th century. The 1952 Falklands War reminded Britain that fragments of empire remained. The islands, claimed by both Britain and Argentina, became the site of a brief but intense conflict. Britain ultimately retained control. It was a small war compared to the world wars, but symbolically it stirred something familiar, a reminder that territorial questions once central to imperial identity were not entirely gone. Meanwhile, at home, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher pushed economic reforms in the 1980s. Industry shifted, privatization expanded. Britain's global role was less about governing land and more about finance, diplomacy, and cultural influence. London emerged as a financial powerhouse. English became the global lingua franca. British universities attracted international students. The empire of territory transformed into an empire of soft power. It's quieter, less visible on maps, but influential nonetheless. And then, of course, the 21st century arrived. Debates about identity resurfaced. In 2016, Britain voted to leave the European Union in a referendum commonly known as Brexit. Supporters spoke of sovereignty, of independence, of reclaiming control. Some observers quietly noted echoes of imperial memory, the idea that Britain thrives best when charting its own course, even if that course once involved sending ships very far away. Brexit was not about rebuilding empire, but history has a way of shaping instincts. Meanwhile, conversations about colonialism grew louder. Statues were debated, museums reconsidered artifacts acquired during imperial rule. School curricula expanded to include perspectives from colonized peoples. It's a gradual reckoning, not loud, not universally agreed upon, but present. The empire, once presented as a civilizing mission, is now examined with more nuance. Acknowledging infrastructure and education systems introduced under British rule, while also confronting exploitation, racism, and violence. It's complicated. And perhaps that's the most honest conclusion. The British Empire rose from a small island's maritime ambition. It expanded through trade, war, industry, and extraordinary self-confidence. It governed vast territories, extracted immense wealth, spread language, legal systems, and railways. It also disrupted societies, redrew borders, suppressed cultures, enforced hierarchies. At its height, it believed itself permanent. That phrase, "the sun never sets," carried a certain inevitability. But suns always set. Today, Britain is a medium-sized nation with a long memory. Its empire is gone in the territorial sense. What remains are connections. The Commonwealth, shared institutions, migration patterns,
cultural blends, and stories. Stories told in calm voices late at night about how a damp island once commanded oceans. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the creak of wooden ships, the scratch of pens drafting treaties, the murmur of administrators in distant capitals trying to make sense of vast lands they barely understood. And then you can hear something softer, the slow folding of maps, the lowering of flags, the quiet acceptance that dominance is temporary. Empires rise, empires rule, empires fall. The British Empire did all three, slowly, methodically, with tea breaks. So as we reach the end of our long, steady wander, let your mind drift. The red shading fades from the globe, the oceans grow still, the sun sets eventually over every horizon. And Britain, once convinced of its endless daylight, settles into evening like the rest of us. Thanks for floating through this story tonight. Sleep well.